Now excited to be joined by a very special guest, a first-time guest. It is Ryan McGee. We had your dad on many, many years ago to
Yeah.
promote the book that you guys wrote together, you and your brother. What's the book that you didn't get to write that you kick yourself thinking about, and why is it the story of 2009 Tennessee?
Yeah. No, it's well, in 2009 Tennessee, and then I'm old, right? So I was a student working for the football team when Johnny Majors was pushed out in 1992. And that's the one I've always wanted to write. And when Coach Majors passed away a couple years ago, I touched on it just a little bit in the story. Everyone knows, no excuse, I'm not a Phil Fulmer guy. And the reason is because, you know, I literally know where the bodies are buried on that deal. And so it was, yeah. But yeah, so some a Tennessee drama book would be. Yeah, my wife is like, and when I met my wife at Tennessee, she was a performer at Dollywood, like she's a playwright. I keep telling her one day, and she's a musician. I keep saying I want us to write an opera about Tennessee football because it would be amazing.
The Pruitt part of that would
Oh,
be
dude.
fantastic. I don't know who you're going to get to play Pruitt and Butch Jones. That would be tough casting because they feel so unique.
Well, if the anger guy from Inside Out was real life, he would play Butch Jones, right?
It's
And
pretty
I'm
good.
not sure you could find maybe. I feel like if you gave Chris Pratt a bad haircut, he could pull off. He could maybe pull off. So I had a chance to speak at graduation at Tennessee just 2 years ago, and what I talked about was that generation to me, and my daughter's part of that generation. She doesn't go to Tennessee, but that generation doesn't get enough credit because that's the school shooting, COVID, so social media. We've thrown way too much at that generation for them to be as normal as they are. And I kind of went through that list I just went through, and I said, we made you guys, go through the Jeremy Pruitt era of Tennessee, and the chancellor thought that was really funny. I was a little nervous about being pulled off the stage, but she was they had literally had just had those hearings where we all sat in the lobby and watched them all walking in and out of the hotel conference rooms with the NCAA. So it was all still a little raw at that point. But yeah, I need to think about casting that film. That'd be amazing.
I look, I would be here for it. I would attend that musical. Haven't attended many musicals in my life. The list is probably about three or four, but I would see that, especially if they got it down here at Dr. Phillips in Orlando.
You
Sign
wouldn't
me up.
survive in my house because my wife is a singer and an actress, and my daughter has followed in his footsteps. And so now I spent way too much time in my life. But you talk about dad though. My mom and dad like loved. They took us to the theater a lot when we were kids, and so I'm not going to tell you I love it, but I'm going to tell you that I've attended more than three. I've attended more than three this year.
Look, the sports musical crossover,
Yeah,
High School Musical tapped into it, obviously,
yeah,
but in terms of like a Broadway style production, it might be, Damn Yankees, like that's
yeah.
one.
My
There's
wife
crossover
played
there.
Lola in Damn Yankees when we first got married, and here in Charlotte where we live. But then I wrote a story for ESPN the magazine years ago about Heisman the musical, and it was not
Okay.
good. But it happened. I mean, that thing played in several cities, but it was all about the 222 to nothing game, and Georgia Tech greasing the rails on the railroad. All this stuff was in it, but it was terrible. But it was but so it is still out. It's out. I need to call College Football Hall of Fame and tell them to track down some old video or something.
I mean, SEC Media Days in Atlanta. Just
Yeah,
we'll
why
make it
not?
happen. That'd
Yeah,
be the perfect spot for it. I got a lot that I want to get to with you, but let's start with Tennessee. Vols are coming off of their best 3 year stretch in 2 decades. It's easy to forget that after the way the Ohio State game played out, but you know, you're a Tennessee grad, so you understand this perspective in very unique ways. But I think there's this angst that could be felt over the course of the next 3, 4 years if certain heights are not reached. You've seen the feels like 98 vibes. You've also seen the why is Butch Jones using that trash can vibes. The trash can, by the way, would have to have a role in the musical of
oh
Tennessee.
yeah, no, it'd have its own song. You put
Yeah,
somebody in like Oscar the Grouch, right? All of a sudden, except he's orange, pops out and
perfect.
sings. See, there you go. It writes itself.
It really does. How should this fan base feel right now about the direction of the program?
All right. So when you say this fan base, what you're talking about is me and my group chat with my old college roommates, the Horsemen. There's five of us. My in-laws, my wife. I mean, everyone. And what I'm constantly preaching to everyone is don't don't not enjoy what's happening because you're obsessed with what you should be doing next. And what I have to remind everyone is, what did this feel like 5 years ago? What did this feel like 10 years ago? What did this feel like 20 years ago? And so enjoy it. And you made a great point though. Like, so I was at that Ohio State game. That game was over in 5 minutes. And it's easy to be hung up on that. But what I always go back to is, you've mentioned 98. People forget, but the year prior to that, Peyton Manning and company got their butts handed to them by Nebraska in what was a national championship game. I go to the College World Series when Tennessee finally won the College World Series, and I was there, last June. It took going to Omaha and having their heart broken a couple of times, and being the number one seed and losing, not even making it to Omaha one year, for them to figure out how to not just get there, but how do you handle it when you get there. And so I tell the Tennessee fan base all the time, enjoy what you have. You made the college football playoff. That box is checked, right? You're back to playing, in New Year's Day bowl games. That box has been checked. You're in the national conversation. That box has been checked. Those boxes weren't checked for a long time. So there's only a couple steps left, which is, being a national championship game and win a national championship. But just enjoy it a little bit. That's what that angst you talk about, and it is well earned, because that is PTSD that it was relived over and over and over and over again. Which is why you could write more than one book about it. But yeah, enjoy what you have now, and hope that you're ready to take the next step. And I think they could. I think that we have the handful of teams that are going to be competing for national championship, and then you have the handful of teams that could crash the party, which is kind of what Tennessee was a year ago. It's who they're going to be again. We all forget Nico's still a kid, and so I think they have the potential to really do it up. The trick is, again, enjoy what you had in 2024 before you ruin this spring and summer already expecting to be disappointed in 2025.
I've been wondering this for a little bit, just based on his temperament, based on how he has approached this job, and now the comps, the side-by-side comps that are becoming more fair. I know you're not a Fulmer guy, but can Heupel be what Fulmer was in that job? Just being a guy that can navigate it for a decade plus and provide that stability? Or is that just unrealistic in today's landscape? And there's just always going to be an expiration date with a coach, unless, of course, you win a championship.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be an expiration date if you don't win a championship. I mean, that's the case everywhere, and it's unreasonable. But that's what makes college football the greatest sport in the world, is unreasonable expectations. It's what keeps guys like you and me with plenty of stuff to talk about, right? But again, I think this goes to the myth of Phil Fulmer, and this goes to the myth of what Tennessee fans, how they feel about the past, because the reality was that until they won that championship in '98, they hadn't won one since the early '50s. And they had great success, but the reality was they were always in the back seat of the Alabama car. They just were, or Georgia, not Georgia, but Alabama, watching other teams win national championships. And so, the Phillip Fulmer thing is like the myth of what that era was. The reality was it was a series of disappointments. They won a national championship in '98, but then after that, you go back and really break it down, it was a lot of disappointing 9-win seasons, and especially the last 5 or 6 years. Half those years were awful, and people forget now they all wanted him fired. And so, even a guy who has a road named after him and who has a national championship ring and who came back as athletic director, and that went great, right? But even that guy, people forget this now conveniently. They ran him out of town on a rail. And so yes, at one day, that it will end poorly for the current coaching staff at Tennessee, because it ends poorly for everyone. No one ever retires, on their own terms unless you're Nick Saban. That's just not how that goes. So yeah, that's inevitable. But it is part of the Tennessee personality, and it's why I love the school and why I love that fan base and why they also drive me crazy, which is that expectation level that is so high. But the reality is that even when you thought things were the best they ever were, they were great for 1 year. And the rest of the time they were in the conversation, which is what everyone wanted, but they really didn't. Every time they had an opportunity to win another ring, they usually figured out a way not to do it.
You were in the great Heisman race of 1997, that 30 for 30. You did a lot of work on that. Can you share the memory that you have post Heisman decision of experiencing what it was like to go back to Tennessee when Tennessee fans hated ESPN and College Game Day was public enemy number one? And you got to experience that firsthand as someone that obviously is this Tennessee grad and working for ESPN at the time and navigating that space.
I had graduated just a couple years earlier. And then at that time, I was covering motorsports pretty much full time, and I was a producer. I wasn't a writer yet. I wasn't a reporter yet. I was a field producer. And so I was sent to Peyton Manning's last home game against Vanderbilt in 97 with Steve Cyphers, the great Steve Cyphers from OG Game Day. Was a reporter. I was a producer. And we interviewed Peyton on Friday during practice. They're in the stands at Neyland Stadium. And the Vol Walk was really new. The Vol Walk didn't show up until the mid-90s. And so, of course, the day of the Vanderbilt game, and it was a crappy day. It was raining, and it wasn't cold, but it wasn't hot. It was kind of miserable. But the team starts the walkover from the football facility past the torchbearer down the hill. We all know it now, but at the time it was relatively new. I had on an ESPN raincoat, and people were throwing rocks at me. And, I swear I think I saw some people that I knew throwing rocks at me, right? And I'm holding up my Tennessee class ring, like, stop it! I just graduated here. I'm rooting for the guy just like everybody else is. And then again, I don't mean this to be a Phillip Fulmer podcast, but the game plan was awful that day. You're trying to win a Heisman Trophy, and they didn't throw the ball at all. Manning had and it was a sloppy day, but whatever. If he can grip it, he can throw it. And it's Vanderbilt. They should have hung 400 passing yards on those guys and 5 touchdowns. And Manning might have won the Heisman Trophy still. But he had one bootleg run for a touchdown, and the rest of the game, I remember standing on the sideline, and an athletic administrator who I will not name from Tennessee, who I'd known from my time there as a student, I'm standing on the sideline, and he leaned over and he goes, you remember that time that Peyton Manning lost the Heisman because they decided they wanted to run the football? And it's kind of how it was. But that was also the day he directed the band. I've got a great picture I took with like a little Kodak, throwaway camera. And then, but I kind of knew that day leaving, I was like, he's not going to win it. There still was that part where you thought, and I wasn't a voter, and there was still that part where you thought he has a chance. But yeah, it's funny how the world turns, man, because now, like I went to Ohio State for the first round CFP game, got off the plane, and the first thing that happened was some guy, in a Eddie George jersey screamed, what the F are you doing here, SEC guy? And I'm like, yeah, well, let's take it back to my alma mater when they were yelling at me because they thought, we were taking the Heisman away from their guy. So it's just, we all hate everyone's team, Connor. You know that. When they give you your credentials to games, there's a thing we sign, right? This is you hate everyone's favorite team.
I pretty much approach this job with that in mind, that I hate your favorite team. Yeah, and yeah. I have a personal vendetta against
each meetings. One. Yeah.
We do. We discuss who's most hated.
Yeah. The internet's right. We all have secret meetings. We all have when we have FCC media days, we all the writers, just so y'all know, we all have a secret meeting where we all say, all right, we're all in agreement, right? We sign the agreement that we hate everyone's favorite team.
I did something last offseason where I disclosed all my biases, and I said this is legitimately how I feel about these specific people, and if it feels like I'm not giving James Franklin the benefit of the doubt, here's why. And here's why, in my experiences, this is why I feel this certain way.
Yeah.
It's something that, look, maybe we need to get into, because there are certain biases that exist, but this belief that everybody is constantly working against your team, it is exhausting, and it's more convenience than ever. And I'm sure you've experienced that in very unique ways over the course of the last 3 decades.
Yeah. And I tell you where I learned the ability to check it at the door. Cause you and I both, we get to talk to college classes, when we're on the road for Marty McGee in the fall, a lot of Fridays, I get a chance to go talk to journalism class or whatever. And within the first three questions is always, well, how do you not root for Tennessee, or how do you not, and you just don't. And I learned this from my dad. My dad, I grew up in the Carolinas. My dad went to East Carolina. I went to Tennessee. My brother went to Wake Forest. My dad got a master's degree at App State. There's a lot of connections there. But when he walked into a football stadium in the ACC, which is where he spent most of his career as an official, he didn't care who won or lost the game. And everyone has a hard time wrapping their brain around that. Back when I was a kid, we were sitting they used to do this at Chapel Hill all the time. You're sitting in the stands, and they would announce today's officiating crew, at Kenan Stadium, so and so and so and so, and so is the referee, and I'd say, and field judge Jerry McGee, graduate of East Carolina University.
What?
And everybody's boo, but the perception was that because of that, and because of where my dad had gone to school 25 years earlier, that he cared who won the North Carolina Duke game. He didn't. And I learned that from him, checking in at the door. When Bill Hancock, when they first started the CFP meetings, he'd have everybody hang their hats up the door or whatever when they came in. That's how you go into the press box. Now, all those years as a Tennessee alum, when I would sit there at Bryant-Denny and watch Alabama just beat Tennessee's brains in, at the time, whatever, I'm covering a game. Now, when I got in the rental car, was I a little pissed? Probably. But you take those hats on and off, and as you get older too, you're not as emotionally involved in it as you used to be. The job's the job. Unless it's your favorite team, y'all, then I hate them.
You've worn a lot of hats for ESPN. Either you or Wright Thompson has this title. Who's been in the most 30 for 30s? Because you've got to be really close. Yeah,
Greg Sankey's joke is that I was actually born in the 1800s, because between SEC Storied and 30 for 30 and CFP 150, I sit there and tell these stories, and Sankey's like, you make it sound like you were at the 1958 Iron Bowl or whatever, and it's like, we know you weren't there. But my wife, well, you know the deal, man. I got all these books, right? If you can see, I basically my office is a library. All this stuff that I've read and my whole life, and the people at the College Football Hall of Fame will tell you, I'll just show up and just want to look at stuff. And my wife, I remember when the CFB 150 stuff aired a few years ago, my wife was like, bless your heart, you finally got to talk about, how Bobby Dodd ran practice, right? All this stuff that, So yeah, but I don't know. Wright at one point got a little shy about being on TV because he thought it affected his ability to like fly on the wall, write stuff. And I feel like I benefited from that, because we need a Southern guy to talk about, fried chicken in Memphis. Call McGee.
Christian Laettner. Hey, that's
yeah. And then sometimes, as I tell my daughter this all the time, who's in college now, wisdom has nothing to do with being smart. It's just that you've been around a long time. And so they start looking for talk about Christian. I was in college when Christian Laettner was in college. I remember all that stuff. And so, yeah, but I was not in attendance for, the first College World Series in Omaha in 1950.
I always love talking to ESPN lifers like you and Fowler and Reese. It's because there are so many people like myself who grew up watching, ESPN and SportsCenter in the 90s. And just the ESPN programming was just such a massive part of our childhood. And at least for me, meeting people like Stuart Scott or Dan Patrick would have been right on par with me going to Old Orchard Mall as a kid and meeting Grant Hill. That's where that would have, stacked up. And I got to imagine that walking those halls when you did in the 90s, having that be like, oh my gosh, I'm just out of college. I'm getting this experience. What was your favorite pinch me moment from that era being at ESPN?
So, I wrote a book a couple years ago about this one summer I worked in minor league baseball. And the first chapter of the book is about me going to ESPN and bombing my interview. Bombed it, because they purposely asked questions about hockey and about the AFC West and stuff they didn't think a kid from North Carolina would know, the answers to. And they were right. But the day I flew myself to Bristol, stayed at what was a Radisson right across the street. I had my coat and tie on, and I'm sitting in the lobby of Building 3, which is the heart of campus, still is. And I'll never forget it. I was sitting there nervous. I don't get nervous. I was terrified. I mean, flop sweat, terrified, waiting to go up and do my interview for a production assistant position. And Charlie Steiner came walking through the lobby, just matter of factly talking with Tom Meese. And that did not help my nerves, dude. Like, it was all of a sudden, but I remember the two of them standing over in the corner and just having this conversation about boxing, and which was Charlie Steiner's bag, and I was just me eavesdropping on those guys. And to the point that when they came down and said, Ryan McGee, like you're at the dentist office, you need to come. I didn't hear him because I was eavesdropping on that. And then the deal was you had a year between interview and hire. If you didn't hear from ESPN within a year, then you had rotated off the list. They called me after 362 days. I still hold the record for that's how bad my interview was. But my first day on the job, same thing, coat and tie, I go do the drug test, and I meet with HR, and I fill out all my paperwork and all that stuff. And they go, well, hey, this is good timing. We have our annual family picnic at Lake Compounce, which is the amusement park across the street where famously Milli Vanilli got busted. And okay, so I go walking across the street, and as I'm walking in, Charlie Steiner comes walking out. He's leaving. He's got to go do the 6 o'clock Sports Center. And Charlie goes, I go, hey, Charlie, this is my first day. I'm really excited to work here. And he looked at me like, okay. And he goes, well, this isn't a funeral. And he just did this because I'm wearing like a black jacket and a black tie. But yeah, that was literally the first 2 times I ever set foot on campus. But it was bizarre, man. It was Reese was brand new. I came in with Kenny Mayne, Reese Davis, Susie Colber, Bill Pito, kind of the original young, cool, Stu Scott, the original kind of young, cool ESPN2 crowd. And that's when the Deuce started. And it was, what's weird though is now, man, it's been 30 years. You go back in the building and there's certain hallways and stairwells smell just like they did in 1994. Like, it's like, it's like being back on college campus. You're like, oh, okay, now I'm back where I am. And then it's not also 19 degrees and you're like, screw this, I'm going home.
You've also had the benefit of not having to live in Bristol your entire time.
Yeah, I was there 2 years. I was in Bristol about just a little less than 2 years, and we set all the snowfall records that they've just broken, like in the last couple of years. And I just remember thinking, but I had a great time. I mean, it's boot camp is what it is. You go to work at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you come home at 4 o'clock in the morning. You're a vampire. You sleep till noon, 1 o'clock, go back to work. And but I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. And just like boot camp, the friends that I made along the way, who are now scattered all over the business, we've got a bond that you can't replace. But it's the only place I ever wanted to work. And I left for a few years and I spent the whole time trying to get back. And so the next time I go, it'll be because they told me to leave.
Yeah, you were able to spend that time at Fox, and then ultimately, you come back and you find this unbelievable like niche where you get to do a variety of things, which is kind of the dream. And it's one of the reasons that professionally speaking, I really look up to your role and what you get to do on a daily basis. And you've been able to establish something that is so hard. I don't know if viewers know how hard it is to keep an on-air partnership. And what you and Marty have been able to do is extremely unique. It really is. And Marty McGee is now a decade old. I've never asked Marty how you guys met, but I imagine it was just some NASCAR pit situation where you guys just started chopping it up and you're like, want to go grab a beer? Something like that. There's got to be some sort of story of you guys connecting and instantly realizing that you guys were going to hit it off.
Well, what's funny is, so when I went to ESPN as a production assistant, again in the mid 90s, I wanted to work on college football and baseball. That was kind of the house I grew up in. And literally the month I started, Jeff Gordon earned what was, to me, still the biggest win of his career. And he was young and cool and my age, and suddenly NASCAR was cool in the building. And what I realized was that the line of people waiting to work on college football and baseball was all the way around the building. The line of people waiting to work on NASCAR was 0 people. And I had this Southern accent. And so they were like, well, you know all about NASCAR, right? And I did. I mean, my dad, again, dad's the man. He was on pit crews, when I was a kid. I'm from Rockingham, North Carolina. So I didn't know as much as they thought I knew, but I knew more than they did. And so started working the NASCAR thing, got me moved back to North Carolina after a couple of winters. I met Marty. We don't remember the exact day. It was sometime around 1999, 2000, and he was writing for like the Lynchburg Gazette, and eventually moved over to Turner to write for NASCAR.com. And I was a field producer. I was a feature producer. So I was on the road 25 races a year with Bill Weber, who everybody knows from Talladega Nights, and Dr. Jerry Punch, who was my hero. John Kernan, all these reporters, and I was their producer, like I was for Steve Cyphers that day in Knoxville. And Marty and I met. We're pretty sure it was somewhere in Virginia, either the South Boston Speedway, the Martinsville Speedway, Langley, one of those racetracks in Virginia. But my claim to fame, and y'all can blame me for this, is when I left ESPN, it was to produce a show for Fox Sports Net called Totally NASCAR. It was a national show, and we needed a Peter Gammons. We needed an insider. We needed a Pete Thamel for NASCAR for the Garage, and Marty was writing for NASCAR.com, and so I'm the first producer to greenlight putting Marty Smith on TV. And he came in as our insider analyst. I remember the first day he was ever on TV for us, him in the green room, with his wife Lainey, and he was nervous and should have been. And I remember telling him, dude, you know more about this than anybody else. Just talk when I say go, shut up when we say shut up, and you're good. And he was really good. I mean, obviously. And then come 2006, 7, he and I both are back at ESPN. And we were driving to the Martinsville Speedway, and for like 2 or 3 hours up there, 2 or 3 hours back. And it was the funniest conversation I ever had. And I was like, man, I think people would dig this. And we called the podcast department, like, just let us record something. And yeah, it's been more than a decade, man. It's crazy. But with my producer hat on, and you know this, there's been a lot of shows that I worked on and that were on TV where you took really, really talented people, like Emmy award-winning anchors, and put them on a desk together, and it just doesn't work because the chemistry's just not there, or they don't like each other, or they're not actually friends. Marty and I were friends first. And so that's it. And so when we do the show now, it's still with the spirit of that drive up to Martinsville that day. And I hope that's what people like about it, is the fact that it's easy. I mean, it's super easy. I'd love to tell you that we have this struggle, and I think he and I've had 2 arguments in 12 years. You know what I mean? So it's just, and they weren't even that big. So it's knock on wood, they still pay us in American money to do it, and we can't believe it.
It was Virginia part of the South? And we know where Marty stands on that. And that was, that probably just led to an argument. And then,
yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. I was like, was it really? Because it seemed to, I always refer to it as a border state, not Maryland, Virginia, but it's not even a damn state. It's a commonwealth. Like, make up your mind. But yeah, he doesn't like that. But dude, I learned this when I started traveling into the SEC that I just didn't know growing up. When I started going into Louisiana and Mississippi and all, they don't think North Carolina is Southern at all.
Oh.
And I'm like, well, how the hell do you think I sound like this? Because, but yeah, they don't. South Carolina, they say yes. North Carolina, they say no. I have no idea why, but that's just how. When I went to school at Tennessee, John Ward, the legendary voice of the Volunteers, when I was working in the athletic department, Ward one day he goes, Ryan McGee said, "So where are you from?" I go, "I'm from North Carolina." He goes, "Oh, I love North Carolina. I used to go there all the time until my passport expired." And that's how people, like in the deep South, feel about North Carolina. So apologies.
I can relate to that a little bit, just in that I live in Florida, but I don't live in the South because I live in Orlando. Like, it's not.
No. Orlando is where the South stops. Everybody says, right? Just north, you're still there. But yeah, once you get into Orlando, but whatever. I grew up in Raleigh. Well, growing up in Raleigh, in the 80s, everyone I knew was from Connecticut, and then when I moved to Connecticut, none of them had ever met a Southerner. So I get that.
I think people appreciate with you and Marty how authentic you sound. And I've talked to Marty about this before, about how, one of the things that he tried to keep at ESPN was his accent, and it was authentic to who he was. The fact that he was covering NASCAR made it a lot easier, but you guys hit it off and sound so Southern. And when you sound the way that people listening to you also talk, And when you look so natural, when you guys are doing your SEC network commercials and it's, driving in a truck, and that's basically what the scene that you just painted with those first conversations. And I could definitely see that type of thing happening. And, you don't necessarily have this like back and forth where it feels like one is stepping on the other's toes. And that's something that's really admirable. And I like how you root for them, even when it's, singing with Celine Dion and harmonizing with her and getting to do stuff like that.
Dude, so people ask all the time, difference between Marty and McGee. And I always tell them, I said, the first thing is that Marty, like I have to buy shoes. I bought my truck. Marty just gets sent stuff, like pallets of stuff just show up at Marty's house because he's famous.
He's elevated your sneaker game too.
Yeah. No, he has. But I bought mine. His were sent to him by like Michael Jordan, But like, so for example, like I was in Boston earlier this week and working on a story I'm really excited about. And I had talked to a really famous singer on the telephone, trying to convince him to do an interview with us. And I just thought it was amazing that I'd had this 5-minute conversation, with this amazing singer on the telephone. And I can't tell you yet, but you'll know once the store runs in April.
Neil Diamond,
yes,
if I had to guess.
And,
okay.
Yeah, it is. And so I'm all excited, right? I'm like, and then I go to dinner with my wife on Fat Tuesday, and I'm literally bragging to her. I think we might, get Neil Diamond, or at very least get like a story. I'm going to get talk to him for a story. And Erica goes, well, Marty's singing with Celine Dion right now on television. So people, you want to know what the difference is between Marty and McGee? The difference between Marty and McGee is that I get excited to interview a singer on the telephone. Marty sings with maybe the greatest singer of the last 40 years, on national television. So it's awesome. But Marty, and Marty loves, he studies country music, like, and he's great friends with Eric Church and Kenny Chesney and all these guys. But he loves to study it. He reads every book that any country music artist writes. But he came to me with the story of Brooks and Dunn. And Brooks and Dunn really don't get along. Never have. And they have tried to break up like 5 or 6 times over it. And he and I the example he's always said to me, we can't ever be those guys, because like Brooks might have a problem with Dunn and Dunn might have a problem with Brooks, but they wouldn't say anything to each other for 6 years. And it just would become a thing. I just read Alex Van Halen's book. And there's clearly stuff that he and David Lee Roth have still never worked out from the 80s. And as a result, they can't keep it together. And so what Marty and I have talked about all the time is if there's an issue, tell me. If you think I'm talking too much, tell me. If you think I said something behind your back, tell me and let's talk about it. And that's, like I say, I think twice we've had 2 arguments ever. And the one time that like it got tense, we figured it out. And that was a long time ago. And so, yeah, knock on wood, man. We try to cancel out jealousy because Lord knows if jealousy was a problem for me, then when, I turn on, Marty Smith's America, which was his TV show he had for a couple of years, and he's on the roof of some building in Singapore interviewing Cristiano Ronaldo, I'd probably be jealous. But I'm not. I'm excited for him because I can't believe a kid from Parisburg is doing what he's doing, and I think he can't believe that a kid from North Carolina is doing what I'm doing.
So what do you want to do that you haven't done next 5 to 10 years? It's a question I feel like I'm asking in every interview now, but especially with media people, I think it's interesting because you've seemingly got ESPN saying, hey, Ryan, do you want to do this thing? Go out and do it. Like you have that freedom. What's something that is still on your professional bucket list that you'd love to be able to kind of check off over the course of the next decade?
It's funny. My wife and I literally just had this conversation a couple of weeks ago, and I have no complaints. I'm doing more than I ever thought I would do. I'm healthy. My daughter's doing great. My wife's doing great. I mean, I wouldn't trade. I love what I'm doing at work, and I'm getting to do it. And I love you mentioned the variety of it. I miss ESPN the magazine for a lot of reasons, but the biggest thing was that, I never knew what I was going to be doing next. I might be doing a snowmobile story followed by Usain Bolt, followed by college football, followed by NFL draft or whatever. And I'm kind of back to that right now, within the company. And so I don't know where the calls are going to come from. And I like that some people don't like that. I won't say instability, but you can't predict what's next. And that part of it I love. And then the baseline is Marty McGee. But I think we're at this crossroads right now in college football where, and I keep going back to my NASCAR experience where, there was one of the great philosophers said, success, can mask really bad ideas. And college football right now feels a lot like NASCAR did 20 years ago, where everybody's doing so well and making so much money that you can make bad decisions right now chasing money that don't look like bad decisions. But 5 years from now, we're going to go, what the hell were they thinking when they did that? Because you alienated the fan base a little bit, the old school fan base. And so I say all that to say, I think the next thing I would like to do is something that reminds us of why we love the sport. It's taking all these things we have now that are new and sometimes scary, but also very exciting. Then how does that tie back? The fact that, I wrote a story this past year, was the 100th anniversary of the Four Horsemen game in 1924. And that was the Army Notre Dame game at 24. Well, the Army Notre Dame game this year was super important. And I think that's what college football needs to have more of right now, which is, that first round of the college football playoff was so crazy new, but the games were at Happy Valley and Austin and South Bend and in the Horseshoe. And it's taking advantage of that. And it's also taking advantage of the fact that we have so many of the greats still with us. And 5 years from now, we won't. And 10 years from now, we definitely won't. So we need to take advantage of having them on the planet with us and some sort of project that can tie those things together. Because I think people are going to start like they did with baseball in the 80s when the salaries really started blowing up. People are going to start leaning into nostalgia more than they ever have. And in college football, they do that anyway. But I think there's a wave coming where you could really benefit from that storytelling wise. And so something along those lines. I know that's very non-committal and amoeba-like, but you get what I'm saying, I think.
The correct answer was actually being a documentarian for the Bill Belichick era at UNC and just writing weekly essays on that.
Dude, that's going to be – it's good. That is – I am so all in on that because, again, I grew up in the Triangle. My dad was an ACC official for 40 years for the most part. How they're going to take who might be the greatest coach in the history of the National Football League and still turn that into an 8-win season in the Mayo Bowl is going to be fascinating because that's how it's going to go.
I'm just saying, ESPN could be calling, hey, Ryan, we need you on just Chapel Hill every single week. Just lock it up. Brian Windhorst to LeBron is Ryan McGee to UNC.
That's it. Well, you talk about a fan base that has always been convinced that I hate them because I've been very open about the fact I grew up a big North Carolina State fan. And my brother went to Wake Forest and my dad went to East Carolina. Well, you must hate us then. The reality is I did when I was 12 years old. But I don't care anymore. And Mac Brown's one of my favorite people I've ever known. But watching them turn that into solid 8-win seasons and third place finishes in the ACC is going to be because that's who they are. That's just what it is.
Yeah. This has been awesome. I want to get you out of here on some rapid fire, just 5 questions. First thing that comes to mind. Does that work for you?
Yeah, sure.
All right. You are the authority on minor league baseball. The best minor league baseball stadium in America is what?
McCormick Field in Asheville, and that's an emotional answer. I wrote a whole book about the summer that I worked there, but the reality is the ballpark's been there 101 years, was carved into the side of a mountain, and was christened by a home run by Ty Cobb. And that's also, by the way, where Crash Davis hit his last home run in Bull Durham. So I'm not sure what else you want.
Yeah, that's okay. That is a good answer. You had to sell me on that. That was a very good sell. Which notable person gave you the most outrage ever for a bottom 10 mention?
I just recently received a text from a former Pac-12 championship coach who wanted to know why during this particular era would ESPN want to run people down with the bottom 10. And I gave him the same talk that I give everyone, which is it's not mean-spirited. We never mention players by name. And the reality is that I've been doing it for more than 10 years now. And when a team who won the bottom 10 championship suddenly becomes good, UT San Antonio, Georgia Southern, or Georgia State, any of those, I usually get a care package. So I'm kind of in it with them, right? When they turn the corner. But yeah, no, that was probably, I got one super, super angry phone call from a former SEC coach who landed in the Sun Belt. And I don't think that call was actually aimed toward me. I think it was just aimed toward life. But I'll let y'all do the math on that.
Was it aimed? Was a trash can mentioned at any point of that conversation? Probably not.
I do not recall, Senator.
Okay. Who's the next first-time national championship coach in college football out of these guys? Or you can pick somebody else. Dan Lanning, Steve Sarkisian, Brian Kelly, Marcus Freeman, Kalen DeBoer.
Dan Lanning, I think he's the easy answer. By the way, just got a new contract. But and I wrote this on ESPN.com. We did a roundtable a couple weeks ago about, preseason stuff. It's still Oregon, right? I mean, they are recruiting at an SEC level. I love Dan Lanning. He is one of my favorite He was one of my favorite personalities in the game when no one had heard of him. But it's still Oregon. They still are we're ranked number one and still couldn't win the Rose Bowl, and still like it's still all of it was there. But the reality was they still, over the last 2 years, have lost the one or two games they needed to win in order to win a national championship. So with all due respect to my boy Mike Bellotti and anybody else who ever coached there, it's the same as it ever was. But I think he's the answer because and he loves it there. Like anytime everybody talks about somebody moving or whatever else, I'm like, Dan Lanning's good. So I think that's probably the answer.
What's your favorite meal you've had in an SEC town?
All right, so I'll get divorced if I don't say Ye Old Steakhouse in Knoxville, which is, folks don't know, that's where the great Bud Ford, sports information director at Tennessee forever, would take writers, and where I would save my money for months to take a date. And my wife and I actually went there on one of our very first dates, my future wife at the time. But we kind of have a hookup at Ole Miss when we go in to do, and again, this is the benefit of having famous friends. So we go in to do Marty McGee / SEC Nation. And I would love to tell you that we are ushered into these back rooms from these 5-star world-class chefs because of me. The reality is because I'm with Tim Tebow and Laura Rutledge, and Wright Thompson usually shows up because he's from Ole Miss. But yeah, I've had a couple of meals like in restaurants that were closed that they just put us in with a private chef that were just crazy. But listen, tailgating at LSU, the best food I've ever had in my life is cooked by some guy whose name you can't pronounce and who has like a glass eye and looks like an extra from Pirates of the Caribbean and is literally just cooking it in a pot that was borrowed at an Army-Navy store and has alligator in it. The food in a parking lot in Baton Rouge is better than anything I've had in a Michelin star restaurant in New York.
I would agree with that. I would absolutely agree with that based on my one experience doing just that. Last one for you. What's a hillbilly headline to describe your career in this business?
Son of an Eastern North Carolina lit head accidentally gets his own TV show. I think it might be it.
That's it. That really is. That tells you everything you need to know about not just your career, but your entire life.
Well, and talk about Wright Thompson. We were doing the show at Ole Miss a few years ago, and we had Wright on the set with us, and he really wanted to do hillbilly headlines, which is hilarious, by the way, because he's won every award there is to win. But Wright, I read one, Marty reads one, we get to Wright, and Wright, instead of reading the one that he had, his headline was two rednecks from Western Virginia and Eastern North Carolina get their own TV show, and no one believes it. And it was like, and the crowd just went crazy because it's the truth. And that's, now I will, if that's the epitaph, that's the epitaph, buddy.
Wright Thompson just improvising headlines on live.
Yeah, whatever. Like it's it makes you mad. Yeah, it's you kill yourself on a story for months, and then you're talking to Wright, and he says two sentences, and you're like, damn it, I could have just written that.
Makes it look easy. He absolutely does. Ryan, really, really appreciate the time. Looking forward to seeing you in Atlanta for SEC Media Days in a few months.
Anytime, buddy.